South Korea had just been eliminated from the World Cup. Hours later, their own president publicly turned on the national team. And by the time the sun rose the next morning, the coach had resigned, a government investigation had been ordered, and one of the most decorated players in the history of Korean football was sitting in an empty stadium, staring at a pitch where his last chance had just slipped away. This is not just a story about a football team losing a group stage match. This is the story of how one decision, made by one coach on one afternoon in Monterrey, unraveled everything that South Korean football had spent 2 decades building, and why the aftermath may have been even more painful than the loss itself. To understand why this hit South Korea the way it did, you have to understand what the World Cup means there, not in a vague general sense that it matters everywhere, in the specific, generational, emotionally loaded sense that it matters in Seoul. Go back to 2002, the joint tournament co-hosted by South Korea and Japan, a nation that had never advanced past the first round of a World Cup, suddenly, almost impossibly, reaching the semifinals, beating Spain, beating Germany, reaching the Final Four of a World Cup while the whole country watched in streets and squares and public screens with the kind of collective joy that only arrives once in a sporting generation. That tournament changed everything. It changed how South Koreans saw their football. It changed the infrastructure the country built around the sport. It changed the pipeline that produced the generation of players who followed. And it set a standard, a psychological expectation, that every South Korean squad since has carried into every tournament. You are not just playing football, you are carrying 2002. The 2010 World Cup in South Africa, round of 16. The 2022 World Cup in Qatar, round of 16 again, on a night that produced one of the tournament's most emotional late drama stories when Son Heung-min's generation clawed their way through. The expectation had been maintained, the legacy had been honored. And then came 2026. Son Heung-min arrived at this tournament as the most decorated South Korean footballer in the modern era. 34 years old, captain of his country, a player who had spent over a decade at the highest level of European club football, earning the kind of individual recognition, the Premier League Golden Boot, Champions League nights that defined careers, that Korean football had never produced before. He had started every single one of South Korea's previous 12 World Cup matches across 3 tournaments. He had carried this team through moments when no one else could carry it. And 2026 was almost certainly his last chance. The group draw had looked kind. Mexico, as hosts, were formidable. But Czech Republic and South Africa were winnable matches. South Korea were considered co-favorites to advance. The path to the round of 32 was as clear as it had been at any World Cup in memory. The tournament opened with exactly the result the country needed. South Korea beat Czech Republic, Oh Hyung-gyu scoring the winner, after coming off the bench to replace a Son, who had been quiet, touched the ball fewer times than any of his outfield teammates, and been replaced before the hour mark. A victory, but with an asterisk. The captain had not been at his best. Then came Mexico. A loss. Son replaced again in the 57th minute. 2 touches in the second match, fewer than in the first. The numbers that coaching staffs track, and that the public only sees when something goes wrong, were telling a story that Hong Myung-bo and his staff were watching closely. Which is why, when the South Africa team sheet was announced, and 11 names were read out, and Son Heung-min's was not among them, the noise inside the stadium in Monterrey was immediate and unmistakable. Jeers, directed at the big screen showing Hong's face. For the first time in his entire World Cup career, South Korea's captain was starting a match on the bench. Hong's reasoning, explained later, was that Son's style of play, the explosive sprint-based movements, the space creation that required intense physical output, had been depleting him in the summer heat, and that bringing him on when South Africa's defensive energy was fading in the second half would maximize his impact. It was a tactical calculation, a genuine one, made by a coach who had thought about it carefully and discussed it with the player beforehand. It was also, as ESPN described it, the biggest gamble of the tournament. South Korea started brightly enough without their captain. Kim Min-jae met a corner with a header that was cleared off the line in the second minute. Lee Kang-in came close shortly after. The early signs suggested the system might work. And then the match settled, became tactical, became tight, became exactly the kind of game where a player of Son's individual quality, the ability to produce a moment from nothing, to create something where nothing exists, becomes not a luxury, but a necessity. South Africa, for all their defensive organization, were not a team that should have been keeping South Korea scoreless. But they were. And as the first half wore on, The absence from the starting lineup became more visible with every chance that didn't quite arrive. Hong brought Son on at halftime. The score was 0-0. There was still time. And then, 18 minutes into the second half, Sepeng Moremi burst down the left, cut inside, and slid a precise pass across the box. Tapelo Maseko took one touch to check back onto his left foot. His neck sent the ball low into the corner. 1-0. South Africa. South Korea pressed. Son worked. The crosses came in, the headers were attempted. None of them found the target with the required precision. South Africa's defense held. The final whistle blew. South Korea finished third in Group A. Their World Cup was not immediately over. In the expanded 48-team format, the best third-place teams advanced. They would have to wait and see whether their results were good enough to survive as one of the 8 best third-place sides. They were not. South Korea were going home. Hong spoke to the media after the match. He took full responsibility. He said that if he had known the result, he would have made different choices. He said that whenever bad results happen, everyone has their own opinion, and that ultimately the responsibility was his. He said nothing more and nothing less. It was honest, it was dignified, and it was the last thing he said publicly as South Korea's head coach. Because while Hong was giving that press conference, something extraordinary was happening on the other side of the world. In Seoul, on social media, in government buildings, and in the mind of a president who had decided that a football elimination required a political response. President Lee Jae-myung posted on X the day after the elimination. The statement was lengthy, it was pointed, and it was unlike anything a sitting head of government had publicly said about a football team in recent memory. He wrote that he was not just taken aback by the unexpected outcome. He wrote that he was utterly baffled. He wrote that it had been proven once again that personnel decisions are everything. He wrote that when favoritism and cronyism take precedence over competence in selecting a leader, the result is as predictable as fire-burning paper. He then called on the Ministry of Culture, Sports and Tourism to launch a formal investigation. He specifically requested a comprehensive review of the organizational, managerial, and sporting decisions that had contributed to the exit. He said that given the significant national taxpayer funds invested in World Cup participation, the public deserved a full account of what had gone wrong. The football world, when it processed what had just happened, was genuinely stunned. A sitting president posting a political statement about a football elimination with language that did not sound like disappointment. That sounded like accusation. Hong resigned the same day. The Korea Football Association, which had already been facing mounting pressure throughout the tournament, now faced the additional weight of a government investigation ordered by the country's head of state. And the Korean broadcasting system, in a detail that became one of the most discussed images of the entire aftermath, reportedly blurred Hong's face during the broadcast of his post-match press conference. A symbolic act from a public broadcaster that captured the specific temperature of public feeling in South Korea in the hours after elimination. The Korea Football Association released a statement of its own. It said that the president's comments had been a great shock and disappointment to players who had been doing their best to repay the support and expectations of the people. The tension between those two institutional positions, the president's investigation and the KFA's defense of its players, sat at the center of the national conversation that was not really about football anymore. It was about accountability, about who gets to make decisions that affect 52 million people, about what the national football team represents and who is responsible when it fails. Hong's appointment had been contentious before the tournament even began. His previous tenure as South Korea head coach had ended after the 2014 World Cup in Brazil. His return in 2024 had raised questions among fans and analysts who wondered whether the KFA was recycling familiar names rather than finding the best available option. Described Hong as having silenced players with authoritarian tactics, isolated forwards with an outdated tactical formation, and produced what they called a disaster of leadership. The language was sharp. The public amplification was enormous. Across South Korean media, the reaction was immediate and unanimous in its intensity, if not always in its direction. Star News Korea ran a headline describing Hong's team selection as the worst ever. Dalian described leaving Son on the bench as a disastrous mistake. International outlets covered the reaction as much as the football. The Athletic questioned whether the decision to bench Son had been the biggest single tactical error of the tournament. And underneath all of it, the question that the national conversation kept returning to when it had exhausted the coaching debate and the federation critique and the presidential investigation. What happens to Son Heung-min now? After the final whistle against South Africa, cameras found him standing at the center circle, not walking off, not celebrating with opponents or consoling teammates. Standing, looking at the pitch around him, taking in the specific silence of a stadium where the match he needed to win had just ended in the wrong direction. He had touched the ball fewer times than any outfield player in South Korea's starting lineups across the first two matches. He had come on at halftime against South Africa and not produced the impact that decades of individual brilliance had trained everyone to expect from him. He was 34 years old. He played his club football in Major League Soccer. The next World Cup would be in 2030. He would be 38. The cameras at the center circle were documenting something that everyone watching understood without anyone having to say it. This was probably the end. Not of Son Heung-min the person. Not of Son Heung-min the footballer. Of Son Heung-min the World Cup player. The man who had carried South Korean football on his back through 3 tournaments. Who had produced moments that a generation would remember. Who had become the most visible face of a sport in a country that had fallen in love with it because of 2002 and never quite fallen back out. The investigation that President Lee ordered will proceed. The KFA will appoint a new coach. South Korean football will begin rebuilding for the next cycle. These things are procedural. They happen after every elimination. What does not happen procedurally is the accounting that football asks of its players. The quiet reckoning that arrives when a career-defining tournament ends not with glory, but with a tactical debate about why the most important player was on the bench for the most important match. Hong said the responsibility was his. He was right. It does not live in one decision or one match or one person. It lives in the accumulated weight of choices made across years, in appointment processes and tactical philosophies, and the pressure that comes with carrying a legacy as heavy as 2002, while a nation of 52 million people watches every pass. South Korea went to the 2026 World Cup carrying all of that. They came home carrying something heavier. And Son Heung-min stood at the center circle in Monterrey, in what may have been the last minutes of his last World Cup, while a government investigation was already being assembled back home. Sometimes football doesn't end when the final whistle blows. Sometimes the hardest part comes after the stadium empties and the cameras finally look away. What do you think? Was the president right to call for a government investigation into a football elimination? Did Hong Myung-bo make the biggest tactical mistake of the tournament? And what does South Korea do now, with Son approaching the end of his international career and the legacy of 2002 still demanding to be honored? Leave it in the comments. These are the conversations this channel exists for.